It is difficult to see how the same thing could be said of plays, poems, or pieces of music, because these can be appreciated in a large number of different settings and contexts. There are some limits. As Scruton points out, it may not be possible to appreciate medieval church music properly in a modern concert hall where the ambience is quite wrong. And it is plausible to think that paintings and sculptures are place sensitive. But in none of these cases does choice or change of location alter the artistic merits of the thing itself. A Palestrina Mass may be poorly suited to the place in which it is sung, but this hardly counts against Palestrina's mastery of music. A huge painting such as The Night Watch by Rembrandt, 1606 to 1669, may lose a lot by being hung in too small a gallery. But this doesn't make Rembrandt any less of a master. By contrast, a building that does not fit its context does count against the mastery of the architect who built it. A third differentiating feature is this: architecture makes extensive use of ready-mades. Some of these are part of what is sometimes called the accumulated vocabulary: the Georgian door, the sash window, the pitched roof, for example. Some are items that other trades and professions design and produce. Electrical and plumbing systems, for example. Technological developments and the invention of new materials also bear directly upon the work of the architect, since the functionality of the building will favor some forms of structure and finish over others. Even the less functional aspects of a building, such as cornices, corbels, and turrets, are provided for in a standard vocabulary that architects use, as well as more specialized features like Doric and Ionic columns. This element of assembly has no parallel in the other arts, though the recent innovation of the art of the ready-made will be discussed in the next chapter. There are no accumulated features which the poet or composer simply assembles. To this extent, the architect is more like engineer than artist. And indeed, on the strength of the features outlined, we might conclude that the architect is a constructional engineer, someone who uses existing techniques and devices to fulfill given functions within a given location, in precisely the way a bridge builder does. But if architecture is a kind of engineering, then using a distinction most closely associated with R.G. Collingwood, 1889 to 1943, but in fact far older than that, we must conclude that it is a craft rather than an art. Does this classification matter? Against it, there is the point with which we begin. That our ordinary way of thinking includes some buildings among the artistic masterpieces of the world, and some architects among the greatest artists. St. Peter's in Rome began under the direction of Donato Bramante, 1444 to 1514, who is widely acknowledged as an architect, but who was later continued by Michelangelo, widely regarded as an artist. Michelangelo was certainly confronted by difficult problems of engineering, especially with regard to the dome. But it seems absurd to suggest that he was a supreme artist when he painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but not when he worked on the design of St. Peter's. One way round this conundrum is to say that all buildings are works of engineering, but only some are works of architecture. This distinction between architecture and mere building is expressly drawn by the influential modernist architect Charles-Édouard Jeanneret-Gris, 1887 to 1965, better known by the pseudonym Le Corbusier. He wanted, of course, to classify his own buildings as the first, but it is a natural distinction to draw. The classic work, an outline of European architecture, by the celebrated architectural historian Sir Nicholas Pevsner, 1902 to 1983, begins with just this distinction. A bicycle shed is a building. Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. Pevsner, 1963. But where does the difference lie? How does the art in a work of architecture relate to the engineering involved in building it? Form, function, and the decorated shed. Pevsner's own answer is this: nearly everything that encloses space on a scale sufficient for a human being to move in is a building. The term architecture applies only to buildings designed with a view to aesthetic appeal. This is a more complex answer to the question than it might seem at first, because it qualifies aesthetic appeal with the phrase designed with a view to. Does this mean that the move from building to architecture is a matter of the builder's intention? In any case, what exactly is meant by aesthetic appeal? Generally, this would be taken to the appearance of a building, how it looks. Pevsner means more than this, actually. But if we stick to appearance, we confront a problem. To locate the architectural element in a building's appearance obliges us to conceive of a work of architecture as a decorated shed, a useful expression coined by Carsten Harries in The Ethical Function of Architecture. Surely when we describe Lincoln Cathedral as a work of architecture, we do not mean to say that it is an enormous shed with lots of decorative features. The problem with the decorated shed conception is that it appears to divorce the building from its appearance and to make the aesthetically significant element reside in appearance alone. It thus bifurcates the activity of the architect as well, because architects, qua architects, are not builders at all, but decorators. This seems counterintuitive. When the British Houses of Parliament burnt down in 1843, Sir Charles Barry, 1795 to 1860, was the architect commissioned to construct their replacement. The result was the familiar building that is now the unmistakable image of London. But a great deal of the decoration that adds to the magnificence of the building, both inside and out, was designed by the Gothic revivalist A.W.N. Pugin, 1812 to 1852. If the decorated shed conception were correct, Pugin would be the architect and Barry the builder, which is not how any architectural history would ever record their contributions to this famous landmark. The problem we are confronted with here can be stated in terms of the familiar distinction between form and function. Buildings must have a function. If, however, that function is satisfied by a variety of forms, from what point of view are we to adjudicate between the different forms of a building might take? From a utilitarian or functionalist point of view, it seems to make no difference. If two different forms serve the same function equally well, and function is what counts, must we not regard them as equally good pieces of architecture? What counts against this strictly utilitarian point of view is that the form of buildings doesn't seem to matter. Indeed, there is a measure of absurdity in even attempting to deny this. While there is no escaping the fact that how well a building serves its function is important, the finest buildings are commended and admired at least as much for their appearance. In other words, people care not just about how efficiently functions are satisfied, but how buildings look. Can we not just say that both form and function matter independently, and that the architectural point of view is best thought of as a combination of different interests and considerations? There is obviously something right about this. structural soundness, functionality, and an attractive appearance are all important in architecture. The question, however, is just how the first two, structure and purpose, and the third, appearance, might be related. Is there some way in which these different interests could be fused and thus give architecture the integrity of an art? If we simplify matters by combining structure and purpose under the conception of function, we are faced with two possibilities. One is that form and function in architecture are quite independent and held together contingently by the fact that some of those who build functional buildings also care about their form. The alternative is that precisely what makes a building a work of architecture is that its form and function are intimately related in some way. Consider the first possibility. Is it possible to build in such a way that form and function are divorced, but given equally close consideration? Sometimes it seems that we can. For example, Orchestra Hall in the city of Minneapolis aspires to this sort of separation. The inside was designed independently of the outside because the dominant consideration, as befits a concert hall, was acoustic. Consequently, behind the stage there are large blocks projecting at odd angles from the wall. Probably many concert goers regard these as an unusual or extravagant decorative feature. But their purpose is not decorative at all. It is the absorption and reflection of sound. Around this acoustically designed hall, an outer shell has been erected. In its construction, the prime consideration has been how the building in its location looks to the passing observer, who may have no interest in its function as a concert hall at all. Such a building is a decorated shed, in the sense that its properties as a shed, acoustic adequacy, have been addressed independently of how it can add decorative interest to the city in which it stands. But analyzed in this way, what is so wrong with the decorated shed? Theorists can assert that works of architecture ought to have a unity. But by what aesthetic or artistic principle is such an assertion to be validated? If those who want to go to concerts and those who want their city embellished by impressive buildings are both satisfied, the builder-architect can claim to have done everything required. Facade, deception, and the zeitgeist. A more modest assertion would be that while form and function can be divorced, it is better when they are unified, because the decorated shed has an aspect of fraud or deception about it. This is often the thought behind objections to facade. When joint stock banks were first established themselves in Britain, they were risky ventures, and the banks that succeeded were those that managed to create and sustain confidence on the part of savers and investors. One way of doing this was to commission large buildings with imposing facades, often with classical features, Corinthian columns, and the like, that had no real function in the building. Their purpose was to lend to the chancy business of banking a false appearance of venerability. In a similar fashion, post-revolutionary architecture in the USA, especially the US Congress, used a classical style of architecture to lend the new republic the appearance of a historical solidity it did not really possess. The grandeur of the architecture belied the fragility of the political institutions within. One way of describing this slightly shameless pillaging of the outward appearance of the temples and public buildings of the ancient world is to say that a distinctive architectural style was simply being exploited to create an illusion. The form of the building was chosen to cast a misleading light over its true function, whereas architectural integrity requires a kind of openness and honesty. Augustus Pugin, whose work on the British Houses of Parliament was referred to earlier, expressed something like this view when he said that every building that is treated naturally, without disguise or concealment, cannot fail to look well. There is, of course, a difference between the rejection of ornamentation and facade and the rather bolder idea that naturalness and honesty in building guarantee its aesthetic success. Both suggestions arise from one line of thought, that good architecture must meet higher standards than merely that of a pleasing appearance. David Watkin, who quotes Pugin on this point, vigorously repudiates his way of thinking. Watkin rejects what he sees as alien moralistic ideas introduced into architecture by Pugin in order to defend the revival of Gothic, for which he was famous. But Watkin finds the same kind of thinking in the writings of Nikolaus Pevsner, quoted earlier in this chapter, who took just the opposite view from Pugin on the matter of revival. Pevsner was famous for his endorsement of modern architecture. But this endorsement arose from a belief in architectural honesty, which requires the architect to be true to the times. In another famous book, The Buildings of England, Pevsner says about the architecture of 1950s London, it ought to be recorded first that the neoclassical, neo-Georgian specter is even now not yet laid. In no other capital known to me would it be possible to see major buildings still going up, which are so hopelessly out of touch with the C20. Pevsner thinks that architecture can be either true and honest in the appearance it presents to the world, or that it can be false and deceptive. Facade and ornamental copying are defects in architecture because they get in the way of honesty. They present an appearance at odds with reality. Watkin, by contrast, is contemptuous of any such attempt to make architectural worth subject to independent, non-aesthetic standards. Who is right about this? To answer this question, we need to determine where a standard of truth in architecture could come from. The quotation from Pevsner suggests an answer. Architecture is false or deceptive if it does not reflect the zeitgeist or spirit of the times in which it is constructed. Pevsner is not alone in this. In fact, it is a thought shared by a school known as Kunstgeschichte, or the historical school of art. The idea takes more and less ambitious forms. One of its most ambitious statements is to be found in the writings of the German theorist Wolflin. Architecture is an expression of its time insofar as it reflects the corporal essence of man and his particular habits of deportment and movement. It does not matter whether they are light and playful, or solemn and grave, or whether his attitude to life is agitated or calm. In a word, architecture expresses Lebensgefühl, feeling for life of an epoch. Others have said the same with respect to other art forms. The painter Kandinsky held that every work of art is the child of its time. It follows that each period of culture produces an art of its own, which cannot be repeated. Efforts to revive the art principles of the past at best produce works of art that resemble a stillborn child. For example, it is impossible for us to live and feel as did the ancient Greeks. For this reason, those who follow Greek principles in sculpture reach only a similarity of form, while the work remains for all time without a soul. Such imitation resembles the antics of apes. Externally, a monkey resembles a human being. He will sit holding a book in front of his nose, turning over the pages with a thoughtful air, but his actions have no real significance. It is not hard to see how this stinging condemnation is to be applied to architecture. Those who seek to copy the building styles and ornaments of the past can only succeed in producing slavish and hence lifeless imitations. Each era must speak for itself, find its own voice, and insofar as architects and other artists fail to meet this challenge, their work is false. The view espoused by Wolflin and Kandinsky, and in a milder form by Pevsner, is generally known as historicism. The theory that history determines both possibilities and necessities for the art and culture, including the religion and morality of each epoch. It is a view that derives in large part from the philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel, 1770 to 1831, whose philosophy of art was outlined at the beginning of chapter 4. However, there is a simpler account of the falseness of facade in architecture that can be separated from this Hegelian context. We do not need to invoke ambitious theories of the zeitgeist or spirit of the age in order to think that copying of styles and the extensive use of facades can rightly be called deceptive. The chief point of building in this way, after all, has often been to make things seem other than they are. What the architect aims to do, and is paid to do, is to disguise the relatively mundane function of a building by a grand exterior, as in the case of some 19th century department stores, or to create a misleading impression of the history and solidity of a company, in the case of the early banks. With these examples in mind, it seems plausible to say that, other things being equal, it is better to avoid such deception if we can. We need not defend such a view with historicist theory or high-minded moralizing, because it amounts to no more than saying that a building which declares its function openly and at the same time succeeds in saying everything the facade was intended to is preferable just because it has the added element of integrity. The qualification, if we can, is important here. Such integrity may not be possible, and the use of decoration copied from classical or other styles may be the best the architect could do. But we can still agree that in an ideal world, the architect would have no need to disguise, and that it would be the mark of a particularly gifted architect to find a way of securing this integrity when others could not. It may be faintly ridiculous, as Watkin alleges, to castigate non-modern styles of architecture for dishonesty in the way Pevsner does. But it is not ridiculous to hold out as the ideal in architectural achievement the construction of an integrated building in which none of its features can be dismissed as copying or relegated to the category of facade and mere decoration. To accept integrity of structure, purpose, and appearance as an ideal does not tell us how it is to be attained. We still need to know in the abstract how form and function are to be integrated. But we may conclude on the strength of the argument so far that an architecture in which form and function are treated separately falls short of an ideal. What makes it an ideal is that organic unity is widely accepted as a mark of achievement in a work of art. In poetry and painting, this unity is between form and content. In architecture, it is one of form and function. But insofar as such a unity is possible, this will enable us to explain what it is that makes architecture an art. But how is organic unity between form and function to be achieved? Initially, there appear to be two possibilities. Either form follows function, or form determines function. Functionalism. The first of these possibilities, that form should follow function, is recognizable as an architectural slogan coined by the American architect Louis Sullivan, although it expresses a view that influenced architecture on both sides of the Atlantic for the larger part of the 20th century. Functionalism is a normative conception of architecture, a doctrine about how architects ought to build. It was promoted with campaigning zeal among architects themselves, who took it to imply the rejection of everything decorative. Its most extreme statement is to be found in a remark by the architect Adolf Loos. Ornamentation is a crime. The belief that function should determine the form is usually associated with modernism rather than neoclassicism in architecture. The belief that function should determine the form is usually associated with modernism rather than neoclassicism in architecture. Yet, this is the view, though not the slogan, of Augustus Pugin, to whom reference has been made twice already. Pugin believed passionately in the superiority of the pointed style of architecture associated with medieval Christianity. Its revival was known as the Neo-Gothic and promoted by Pugin in several architectural treatises, as well as a large number of buildings exemplifying the style. This extraordinary productivity in the space of a short life, he lived to the age of 40, did much to make the Neo-Gothic dominant in 19th century British architecture. A vast number of churches in this style were commissioned, but so too were public buildings, of which Manchester City Hall is perhaps the grandest. It was Pugin's view that every feature of a building should be necessary for convenience or construction, and consequently, that ornament should be limited to the essential structure of the building. It should be the concern of architecture to serve the business of living, and the best architecture did this superlatively well. This is what made him a functionalist. But Pugin was also an enthusiastic Christian, and believed that since the best form of life was Christian, the best form of architecture was to be found in that period when life was most extensively Christianized, namely medieval Europe. This is how he arrived at the conclusion that functional building is best realized in the pointed architecture of the Gothic period, and that is why he advocated a return to it. To say that form must follow function is another way of saying that a building should be constructed in accordance with its use. There is some obvious truth in this. A school which was so organized that it made teaching virtually impossible. The teacher's voice did not carry. The blackboard or screen was hard to see. There was no storage space, and so on, would be an architectural failure. Similar constraints apply to more general functions. The building should keep out the wind and rain and protect against extremes of heat and cold, etc. But though close attention to general and special functions will determine many features of the building, it cannot determine them all. For example, a school will serve its function just as well whether yellow or red brick is used for its walls, and even the more obviously architectural features of a building may remain indeterminate when the demands of function have been apparently satisfied. Functional considerations can make a pitched roof preferable to a flat one, but this will not determine whether the gables are crow-stepped or not. Formalism and space. Form, then, cannot simply follow function, for even in buildings of considerable functional complexity, an exclusive focus on function would leave too many issues concerning its construction undecided. Sometimes architectural functionalism is understood as the normative view, that since it is only the functional aspect of a building that matters, architects should eschew the kind of extravagance one finds in the Jugendstil buildings of the early 20th century, and construct buildings of the stark and unadorned kind associated with modernism. However, there are two errors here. First, the failure of function to determine form is a logical failure, not the practical one of ignoring simplicity. Jugendstil buildings, like the buildings of Gaudi, were exuberantly decorative, it is true. But the point is that even a wholly determinate description of function cannot be made to imply a determinate description of form. Second, the sort of austerity characteristic of modernist buildings is not the logical consequence of a belief in functionalism, but precisely its opposite, the belief that function should follow form. The principal influence on modernist architecture was Le Corbusier, whose insistence on the difference between architecture and mere building was noted earlier. Le Corbusier conception of architecture is of a pure art which explores space and shape through the medium of construction. This conception developed out of strict classicalism, an architectural school which aimed to purify imitative neoclassicism by stripping it of all moldings, ornament, and detail, leaving visible only the structural and proportional elements. One of Le Corbusier's early buildings, the Villa Schwob, 1916 to 17, was of this kind. But it was the wholesale destruction brought about by the First World War that stimulated him and others to establish CIAM, C-I-A-M, the Congrès International des Architectes Modernes, in 1928. The aim of this organization was to promote a revisionary conception that would make architecture a contributor to the rebuilding of European society. Viewed in this light, the role of the architect changes. No longer the servant of historically conventional or politically sanctioned functions, architects assume a far greater significance than that of simple builders, designers, or engineers. Their place is alongside visionaries and opinion formers, and their role is to show people how to live. The influence of this line of thought was most marked in the design of housing. Here, architects set out not to satisfy preconceived ideas of domestic accommodation, but to show what domestic accommodation could be. The examples are legion, but in his famous Unité d'habitation in Marseille, Le Corbusier himself supplies the classic example. 337 apartments on top of massive pilotis, or pillars, of concrete, marked with the lines of the timber shuttering into which it was poured. It was a model of public housing that was to be followed thousands of times in many countries. The aim at the heart of this school of thought was the opposite of Pugins, whereas he accepted medieval Christianity as the right way to live. and saw the Gothic style of building as its architectural expression. Modernists like Corbusier thought that architecture ought to not to passively accept, but to actively fashion ways of living. The relative simplicity of the style and lack of ornamentation arose not from a desire to let function determine form, but from a realization and confinement of function within geometrically simple forms, namely, the artistic exploration of space itself. Siam's definitive statement was the Athens Charter of 1933, together with the German modernist school known as Bauhaus, after Das Staatliche Bauhaus Weimar, whose first director was Walter Gropius, 1883 to 1969. The influence of this conception of architecture across Europe and the United States was immense. It even reversed the roles of architect and client in accordance with its theories. For whereas formerly clients had decided what sort of building they wanted and had found someone to build it, increasingly they turned to architects to tell them what sort of building they ought to want. The theme of Tom Wolfe's polemical book, From Bauhaus to Our House. But the result, as almost everyone concedes, was widespread failure to satisfy need. Houses and apartment blocks were built in which no one wanted to or could live, and gigantic offices were created in which working conditions were often intolerable. This functional failure was illustrated most dramatically in 1972, when the Pruitt-Igoe Flats in St. Louis, Missouri, which had won an award from the American Institute of Architects only 17 years before, were blown up at the unanimous request of the residents because they had proved impossible for daily living. Similar steps have been taken elsewhere. In October 1990, the largest ever controlled destruction of buildings took place, when 8 huge blocks of British Council flats in the same modernist style were destroyed in under 3 minutes. Not only was life in these buildings intolerable, but their construction was so poor that it would have been prohibitively expensive to repair them. Modern architecture is now almost universally deplored and generally regarded as having failed. It is easier to record this failure than explain it adequately. One of its causes was undoubtedly the disregard for historical accumulation that the modernist school displayed. An early declaration of Siam expressed the intention that it is only from the present that our architectural work should be derived. And this meant ignoring the experience of the ages in satisfying the real needs of the people who were to make use of that work. Generally, the modernists were undeterred by popular opposition to their plans because they believed that people would have to be educated in the new architecture and shed their preconceptions of what the experience of living in a building should be. Le Corbusier himself took this view of objections to his designs, believing that his work constituted a crusade against unthinking convention. However, the aim of teaching people how to live falls easily into the assumption that they have no worthwhile opinions of their own on the matter. And not surprisingly, the buildings the modernists constructed were almost invariably regarded as unsatisfactory by those for whom they were intended. It is a fact about human beings that they tend to cling to the tried and the familiar and resist anything new. This creates difficulties for the truly innovatory. Nevertheless, the opposition to modernism in architecture can be seen to be based on something deeper than mere conventionality, and evidence for its depth lies in the fact that it eventually led to the defeat of the modernist school. It is real needs and purposes that many modern housing schemes, schools, and office blocks have failed to meet. But this failure arises at least in part from a philosophical flaw in the modernists' central idea. Just as function cannot wholly determine form, so form cannot wholly reconceive function. The form of a building must in part be determined by its function, whether consciously or not, because the function is to a large extent independently determined. A multi-storied parking lot, for example, could have a design which explores volume and space in a manner so striking that it thoroughly alters our idea of what a parking lot can be. Even so, in the end, it must satisfy the purpose of housing cars safely and conveniently. Moreover, no artistic conception, however brilliant, can make a multi-story car park into a dwelling place, because people are not cars, and they both want and need a different sort of shelter. Differing needs and practical requirements mean that car parks and houses have to differ in form and construction, and the most imaginative architecture cannot change this. In short, aesthetic form can no more determine function exhaustively than function can determine form.